Hello! Welcome to another GeoTech Hour and the start of 2021. We're beginning a new year here at the Atlantic Council's GeoTech Center. I'm Dr. David Bray, your host and inaugural director. We're joined today by an august panel that's going to be talking about tech and data recommendations for the new administration that will be starting later in January of this month. And the goal here is to put forward ideas that highlight both why these ideas matter and what we should do, and then ultimately how we could go about making this happen within the government setting. We want to think broader than just the United States, though. We want to think about how we actually act together on the international stage. And we also want to make this sort of as a mini time capsule into the future. Imagine 10 years from now when people look back and say, what were the choices that were presented to us in 2021 for a better future ahead? With that, first, I'd like to go to Joe Bonneville. Dr. Joe Bonneville, welcome back to GeoTech Hour. Glad you could join us. If you could highlight for us briefly sort of why there are certain areas that you think we need to tackle and what those areas are.
Hi, David. Happy New Year to everyone and Happy New Year to the panel. Welcome back. I'm happy to be here in 2021 and survive 2020. As I start to think about the things that we're doing right now and the things that the new administration needs to take care of, my first thoughts were to go to the DoD, but I'm going to step away from that DoD type of perspective and really look at what's going on in the pandemic and the circumstances behind the pandemic. I think moving forward, the Internet of Things is going to be probably one of the biggest factors that we need to focus on. Everything from the supply chain and logistics of hospitals and getting ventilators in the individual rooms and making sure that we have the right number of nurses and staff on hand to ensure that we can get this inflow of patients that are coming in, that are coming out of this Christmas and coming out of this Thanksgiving holiday and causing mass infections and mass cases of COVID-19. How do we virtually take care of them? So telemedicine, right? So what if you're getting a ventilator, or nowadays everything's connected to the internet? I think David told me there's about 45 billion connections going on right now. How do we ensure that we're giving the best type of virtual care? How do we ensure that we have the best nurses and doctors on staff? And how do we move that telemedicine forward? I think if you think about the Internet of Things, you think about post-pandemic, what do we do? You then begin to talk about the Internet of Behaviors, right? And so when we go back to work, when we go back to the TSA, or we're flying like we are normally, are we going to have a RFID chip that monitors us to make sure we wash our hands, to make sure we are adhering to any protocols that are out for the state? So you start to think of these things, you get a little bit worried. You start thinking about like maybe the documentary, The Social Dilemma, where are we being broadcast to, or are we being told what to do? But what line do we look at when we start looking at how these connections and these digital dust particles that we're dropping out, how do those effectively help us manage being safe versus versus going overboard? I think the Internet of Things is probably the biggest thing. It eclipses everything from cybersecurity to autonomous navigation and digital predictions. And so for me, I think that is, first 100 days, how does President-elect Joe Biden go in? He needs to make sure that he understands the capabilities and capacities that he has in order to ensure that we have the right telemedicine and supply chain logistics kind of moving forward. And then post that, what does going back to a normal life look like using the technologies that we already have?
Excellent, Joe. And I really liked how you sort of said, again, obviously we've still got COVID-19 crisis going on. We've still got a surge in cases going on. So thinking about how we can use technology to both get ourselves through the COVID-19 crisis, get people healthy again, and then ideally get them back to work. You mentioned the Internet of Things and really the fact that it is already, that humans are now the minority relative to the number of network devices that are out there. There's about 45 billion. And estimates are anywhere in the next 2 to 3 years, we're looking at possibly 100 or more billion network devices. So if that's the future we're going to, I guess, recognizing you're not, here in a personal capacity as a GeoTech senior fellow, you're not representing the DoD, but are there things where maybe a combination of public civilian side and DoD lessons could be learned? And maybe if you could real quick do some highlights as to the telemedicine space, but then also what you might think about in terms of how we can use IoT to create better societies.
So I think kind of focusing, if we take a step back at your question and say, well, what does that look like, right? And who's the first early adopters, right? So let me rephrase that. The early adopters of a lot of these things is the DoD, right? So we are generally the guinea pigs for a lot of the things. I hate to use the word guinea pigs, but we are generally the guinea pigs for kind of taking the first stab at something that may be 4 or 5 years out, right? So everything from internet protocols and how do we go into our spaces now and trying to understand what's going on in those spaces, right? So to answer your question more directly, I think the future is going to look like an RFD chip. I think there's going to be facial recognition monitors that are in every building that ensure that you don't have a high temperature, ensure that you have your mask on and things of that nature that are going to alert you or identify things to change your behaviors that over time, kind of Pavlov's kind of training that will be, oh, I forgot my mask. Oh, I forgot, I think we all have kind of experienced that. I forgot my mask. Let me run back to my house and get my mask. I think as we move forward, that stuff will be more automated using kind of surveillance, if you will, the Internet of Things and kind of trying to understand how do we keep our society safe. I think the DoD is going to really focus on kind of this human machine collaboration. So how do I have things that monitor autonomously and alert me versus how am I actively monitoring those things? I think that's something we've already kind of transitioned to, but we're going to continue to figure out and move through what does that look like? On the telemedicine side, I think medical providers, and I won't try to be a medical provider, but I think they need to figure out what long-term care, monitoring everything from EKGs to heart to blood pressure, heart rate, blood pressure, and respiration from anywhere at any time is going to be very important in ensuring that we have the quality of care that we need while keeping everyone else safe. And so I think telemedicine is going to, and we've kind of already seen it, it's moving towards kind of the new age of healthcare.
Excellent. And I know there's already some interesting work that's being done by companies where you can instrument your home. So if you have an elderly parent, you can know if they have a fall, but you can also know their rhythms of life. So if all of a sudden they're waking up in the middle of the night or they're showing signs of possibly early onset dementia, that could lead to interesting improvement in care. So I really appreciate that. And of course, raises lots more deeper questions about how we make sure people still have control of their data or still have some influence in the data. So now going to segue to Dr. Melissa Flagg. Welcome, Melissa, back, a longtime friend of the GeoTech Center as well. What are your recommendations as to the broad areas that we should be thinking about with the new administration?
Well, thanks again. And I always love being at the GeoTech Center. This is a great way to start the year. Happy 2021, everyone. I'm going to restrain myself from just sort of jumping onto everything just said and building on that because there's so much richness there. But I do think that actually where he ended is a place that is very interesting to me. And that is that I sort of lived through 9/11. I'm dating myself here. But I just remember thinking in that moment, we were making these big changes. We were doing the Patriot Act. We were creating DHS. We were making massive changes societally to how we entered buildings, to how we entered spaces, to how we boarded aircraft. And it was really unclear at that moment how many of those things were crisis specific and how many of those things were fundamentally going to alter our culture. And I think a lot of people didn't feel like they had a voice in that. And I think what we've seen with COVID-19 is a lot of frustration around people feeling that they should have a voice. And that plays out in lots of different ways. So I think that we're going to have an interesting conflict created between people feeling comfortable with these choices being made for them and people feeling like we really need to lean into the future and embrace this. So I've been thinking about maybe the idea of almost creating a data clinical trial, a version of the clinical trial. And this is something I would really suggest that the administration lean hard into, which is as we as a society begin leveraging more and more data that's traditionally been considered sensitive. And we have this flowing across, just beaming everywhere with unreliable levels of security and encryption across the board, as is just natural. And I will leave the cybersecurity to Bob and others to discuss. I think there's a really interesting opportunity to ask people who are more comfortable with this to actually opt in and to create an idea of a clinical trial that has sort of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, where you're expanding the population, phase 4, where you're doing this over a long period of time, and you're looking at the unintended consequences and the side effects of having this much of your personal data exposed. So I think there's a great opportunity here to both embrace it, but to also take a novel approach to being serious about it and recognizing that it matters. I think a second thing that I would just say for the administration is we do not really even have our hands around what the global economic situation is going to look like. But what we do know is that it's going to be challenging, and it's not just going to be challenging for America. It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenging situation globally. And because of that, I do think we really have to rethink our almost sort of set of domestic alliances. We think about alliances internationally, and we think about our domestic situation as like the private sector does what they do, philanthropy does what they do, the government does what they do. I really think that the administration should really consider creating specific roles in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, in the Department of Defense, maybe in other agencies. And their job is specifically to understand American industry, to understand the states, the competencies, the capabilities, the challenges that our individual states have, to understand the role of philanthropy and the high net worth individual in funding a lot of these breakthroughs that are happening now as well. And without that role, what we saw was in COVID was a lot of people volunteering to help, and no way for the government to effectively span that, integrate it, and then push out help. And I do think that having a central person who's responsible for that does matter.
Really love that, Melissa. There's a lot there, and maybe if I could actually just a real quick rejoinder that builds upon the two is, like you said, obviously the economic situation, we've got to figure out how to make it work for everyone coming out of the pandemic. And like you said, data, increasingly, we need to figure out how we can do some, whether we call them clinical trials or test cases that put people in charge. We had in the 1990s this thing called Biosphere 1 and Biosphere 2, which was trying to figure out how people could live in self-contained communities. Do we need something like New Sphere, the idea that it is the ideas that surround you, especially because, as Joe already talked about the number of devices on the planet, but all predictions are in 2 years or less, we're going to have 3 times the amount of data that our entire species has ever fed being produced on an annual basis. And so that's just sheer volumes. And so if you were to think a little bit about how this could actually help with economics, maybe you could unpack a little bit about, could the private sector start trying to figure out how digital agents could actually help us make sense of all this data? Or are there other things where this could really be, like you said, thinking about the domestic partnerships beyond just the divide between government does this and private sector does this? I'd be interested in your thoughts.
The private sector is 75% of American research and development. I mean, you're not going to do anything that's tech-based where they do not have a say in what actually happens or does not happen. If they're smart, they will try to get ahead of regulation and regulate themselves. Mm-hmm. They will try to get ahead of the fear that will be generated by having the private sector in charge of so much of people's individual data and information. And they will try to create things like New Sphere, clinical trials, and probably a suite of approaches that are culturally relevant to the type of data you're discussing, right? I don't think we're there yet, but I think largely if there were a person in the government whose job was to engage, this is the kind of conversation they would be having with industry, which is we are moving very fast down this path and you need to be creative or we're going to get creative for you.
I like that. It's a seesaw model. Either you do it or we're going to get on the seesaw. I like that a lot. All right, now I'd like to go to Dr. Divya. Divya Chandra, thank you again for joining us at the Atlantic Council of GeoTech Hour, a longtime friend. Would be interested in your thoughts about what the next administration that's coming on board should be thinking about as well for the future.
Well, again, both Melissa and Joe referred to so much richness in their answers. And so I'm going to reorient the way I was going to answer that question. When we finished medical school, we essentially take the Hippocratic Oath. And as part of that oath, we make a commitment to do no harm. And to some extent, a lot of what I see us talking about, all these tech solutions, are ones that could either really help humanity, but they could really go awry. And so I think as the new administration moves forward in deploying this new data and tech, I really want to ask them to sort of hold on to this principle of doing no harm. That being said, I'm going to try and take that 30,000-foot view and give you a few areas that I actually think are our tech and data imperatives. Why do I think tech and data are so important? Because a data-centric administration and data-centric policies are going to enable us to manage and care for our citizens, to provide intelligence, and as you like to say, David, sense making, to aggregate data insights for the sake of public policy. They will help us maintain our intelligence operations, defense of the homeland, and to some extent maintain our technological superiority in the global stage. And we have a lot of competition there right now. So here are some of the strategies I think are going to be very important to achieving that. One is our ability to bring together multiple data streams. What do I mean by this? Let's take the pandemic, and we can get more specific later, but within the pandemic, we had data signals coming from the traditional sources, the healthcare sector itself. How many people were being admitted to hospitals? How many tests were coming up positive? What was the death rate over what our normal background death rate was? But David, as you know, things like market signals may also be giving us information. Google searches for "I can't smell anymore." Things like imaging from space, noting that there are animal migrations or that there are spikes in temperature. By the way, yes, NASA satellites can actually detect temperature changes in animals on Earth.
Yeah.
So the ability, right, to take these multiple data silos and combine them is going to be very, very key. In order to do all of this, we're either going to have to ditch a lot of our legacy systems or start to digitize data in our legacy systems. And we're also going to have to start deploying data fabrics that can do some of this stitching and integration. And it brings me to one really important final point, which is interoperability. So I'm going to go to space, by the way, because I adore space. And I feel like space, we pioneer a lot of the technology we use on the planet. For many of you in our audience, you'll recognize that we have a new initiative in the United States to go back to the moon. And this is not just a US initiative. We have a lot of international partners in this endeavor. And this has been called the Artemis Project. And there are a series of policies that were created in the Artemis Accord, which is a model for peaceful international cooperation for the development of the moon. Interoperability is one of the key pieces of this. It's basically the idea that if I upgrade my laptop, I should be able to plug my peripheral devices into my new USB-C port that formerly plugged into my USB-A port. So there's interoperability of this type of level, but there's also interoperability of data itself. And for data to be interoperable and to be used effectively, it has to first be named. It has to be named according to standards that everybody understands. And so I think this interoperability piece is going to be key. And then the final piece of it is communication. For instance, we don't have a sufficient broadband network even within the United States. We have deserts. The Artemis Accords, actually communication, Nokia is actually going to be taking over the communications infrastructure on the moon. We need to be incredibly forward thinking like this about our own planet, about our own nation. Without broadband connectivity, we can't be competitive, we can't educate our children, and we can't deliver that telehealth that Joe was so eloquent about talking about. Because if you can't reach people, then there's no way to connect all of us that are so remote. So.
Excellent. I really liked what you were saying. Think about what we can take from the vision that we have for space and then make it local here on the ground. So if I could ask you sort of a follow-on rejoinder to that, Divya, as we think about how we bring together and integrate data and think about how we make that happen, do you have thoughts about how we can make sure, sort of building on what Melissa and Joe were saying, how we make sure it doesn't become surveillance state and that people have a locus of choice or control? How can they be involved?
I think we have to start getting a little bit more creative about our data strategy. So I love what Melissa said about creating this almost data clinical trial. unfortunately, I have a sense that I know some of the outcomes of that clinical trial, which is the more data that anyone or any organization collects, the more will be the temptation to utilize that data for the good of the organization and not necessarily those that are producing the data. And so I think that a focus on data producers and some degree of at least co-ownership, if not full ownership of their data, so they can now transact with it. And we may not have time to get into how this could be accomplished, but there are both network strategies and data strategies that would enable data producers at the edge to both be able to encrypt their data, to own their data, to name their data, and then to transact with their data. And that would be one sort of fault. If you want my data, you're going to have to ask me for it, and you're going to have to tell me what you want it for. And I believe almost in the creation of an IRB, these are policies we have at universities in order to collect data from our patients to do research with it. We have to tell them why we want that data and what we're going to do with it and how we're going to protect it. And I believe that the government should be engaged in sort of a global IRB in terms of what are they going to do with our data, and what kind of data do they actually need. I think the last piece of it is on an as needed basis. If you need data from me to accomplish X, Y, and Z, you don't need everything else about me. And you should only be able to access that data. We should be able to modularize what kind of data you are collecting or accessing at any given time.
Well said. I really appreciate that. And I like how you said, trying to make it so it's modular so that it's not collect everything, but instead it's trying to figure out what's useful for a very specific purpose. All right, Bob. So we've heard from 3 august speakers, but that's why we saved you to sort of bring it home for us. What do you think, and why is it important? What are the things that this administration should be thinking about for the next 4 years ahead?
If I were able to speak to this administration, everybody involved in technology and policy, I would say there's something I recommend you really, really, really believe. One thing to really believe, and then 3 things to focus your actions on. That thing that I would encourage you to really, really believe, it's what William Gibson said in 2003. The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And the reason to really, really believe that is it's true. You can find the future if you're looking for it in the startups, in companies that are producing great technology, in the research labs, in academia, globally, in nations across the world that are creating and writing and envisioning the future. You can see the future. You can find it. So please, new administration policymakers, understand that the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And we need, now, it doesn't mean that everything you read is going to come true. You have to put some thought into what do you want the future to be? What do you want to accelerate into your reality? But the reason to believe this so much is it should encourage you to lean forward and coordinate and talk and collaborate and learn what others have discovered before you, because they're out there. And far more of that needs to be done. Far more of this process of understanding reality and what's being built and what's good for humanity and what we should accelerate. So if you believe that one thing, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed, I think it puts you in the right mental model to take the right kind of collaborative, collegial actions we all need. What 3 areas would I recommend the new administration focus on? One is trust. The second is space. And the third is quantum. Now, in trust, I include cybersecurity. Much more needs to be done in block and tackle cybersecurity, improving supply chain, mitigating threats, understanding what the bad guys are doing before they do it, interfering with their plans, interfering with their infrastructure. That's an important part of trust. But there are other components of trust. One I want to mention is this revolution in blockchain and cryptocurrencies. It's real now. Bitcoin has been around for just a few years, but it has already risen to number 11 in terms of total market capitalization of any asset. Largest asset in the world is gold. Bitcoin is coming close. It will one day be the new gold. It is a store of value. And it's important to mention as the administration thinks through that element of trust, because Bitcoin is becoming the new gold. Already the current administration has been passing some rules that are kind of trying to hold back from the inevitable. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency just passed one yesterday saying that, okay, banks can use blockchains to settle transactions. This is a watershed moment. It's coming. And it's a great way, when I talk about trust, it's great because it's a distributed, very open way of verifying what truth is. So I would encourage the new administration, when you think about trust, think about cybersecurity, also think about blockchain technologies. One other component of trust is your own decision making. How do you make decisions? Several of us were talking earlier about the National Security Council as one example. That is an important decision-making body for the nation. It really needs a revamping. There's a great paper published out under Stanford, which talks about the changing dynamics of technology and how the National Security Council needs to change to adapt, become more proactive. They really need leaders there who understand technology and are not just a political scientist. And I think I want to ask Melissa her thoughts on that too. I know she has some anecdotes, but we really need to revamp the NSC to be ready. So that was the first component, trust, and that means cyberspace, blockchain, and also trust in your own decision-making. Quantum is something we have all been tracking for a long time. And the problem with quantum is it is counterintuitive. It's not part of the reality that we grow up with, but tens of thousands of experiments and dealing with reality for years proves that things are strange down there in the quantum world. And leaders need to understand that. They need to understand that this thing called entanglement, and they need to understand the wave-particle duality of nature down there and the uncertainty of quantum. And they need to understand the new applications being developed, including quantum computers and also quantum encryption and quantum key distribution. And the government has a role to play there. I think the government should continue to fund research and push and encourage because quantum is really going to change us. So we need to think, how does it change our business models? The third thing I would really encourage the government to continue doing, space. We've already talked a bit about space. Space is a critical role for all of humanity. The government needs to think through, where do we lead and where do we follow? And that's going to be a continuous question. The obvious thing everybody wants to do is grab. I will lead. Well, you need to think through maybe some parts you don't need to lead. You need to back up and let others lead and let industry lead parts. And that decision making is something the new administration is going to have to think through. So for the new administration, please believe one thing. The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And please focus your energies on three things: trust, space, and quantum.
Very well said, Bob. And I liked how you actually put forward that it all begins with the recognition that we have to figure out how to bring the future about so that it is ideally more evenly distributed, but also there's a consequence to that. As technology becomes more democratized, also come both the good and as the challenges with more people having access to technologies, which gets to a related question. So we're going to start segueing because we've got lots of questions that we've gotten online. So I want to thank everyone who's been doing it. Please keep them in. One of the ones we got from Mike Nelson was a question that he seemed a little skeptical about whether or not we'd see places like the Department of Defense or other government agencies doing a more inclusive approach to data. And I actually want to put forward a challenge to Mike and say, well, if you don't, then you leave open the misinformation space, which is if you aren't involving the public, then you allow others to drive wedges saying, oh, that agency X is doing something behind the curtain that's not in your interest. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is public, but I would be interested in your thoughts, Bob, because you're seeing the weaponization of the misinformation space and how that's being done. Are there thoughts you have about how government needs to get ready for a world in which the great news is everything's 24/7 and anybody can write whatever they want, but the bad news is everything's 24/7 and anyone can write whatever they want? What would be your recommendations for the new administration when it comes to dealing with misinformation?
Well, I have to say, first of all, it's an honor getting a question from Michael Nelson. This guy puts a lot of thought into things like this, and his questions are always well thought out. And I have to say, we need to think through this in ways that I have not been able to solve. I look at the, yesterday there was a misinformation attack. I think it was this broadcast over HF frequencies of a coming attack, which was it was a computerized voice listened to by FAA air traffic controllers, which said we are going to attack the Capitol tomorrow. And some people say, oh, and the attack attributed itself to this is in revenge for the Soleimani killing. So was that a cyber attack? No, it didn't come, nobody hacked any computers, but it was definitely something. Was it misinformation? Probably. It could have been just some smart kids who created this, or it could have been a nation state misinformation, disinformation campaign to kind of cause us to overreact and pull us into something we don't want. How do we rapidly sort out when something like that happens and do a few things? One, get the truth out, and two, decide the right course of action to take. Now, that's just an event yesterday because it's top of mind. But what about every company out there and every government agency who's subject to misinformation and disinformation? What should they do about it? Well, a lot of research has been done, and there are action plans that can be put in place to help companies and governments deal with misinformation and disinformation. And the short version here, I would say, put someone in charge and exercise yourself. Do tabletop exercises where you work through the scenarios and be ready to rapidly respond. And that response is usually not just getting the truth out, but getting the truth out in the right frame that is understandable, because sometimes the framers of the misinformation get that into people's heads so quickly, it's hard to get it out. So it would require a much longer kind of answer. I'm sorry if that didn't quite scratch it.
Oh, I think that was great, and we definitely, like you said, we could easily dive deeper, maybe a future GeoTech Hour, but I really appreciate your thoughts there, Bob, about make sure you're practicing, make sure you're being aware that this is being done, and we need to be aware of it, and that's why we may need to involve the public more in ways that we haven't historically done. I'm going to go first to Melissa and then to Divya, because I see there's a rejoinder as well on this. So Melissa, you first.
Yeah, I love this question from Michael because I think it's clearly not a one size fits all. Whereas I don't necessarily see the intelligence community doing a public IRB, I do see them doing an internal clinical trial to see how at risk their individuals are now because there's so much data out there and it's easier to find people. Right. And so I think there's absolutely some internal things the intelligence community will do that should be, in fact, using much more sort of longitudinal efforts to understanding the side effects and the downsides, but also the opportunity space, right? So I take the clinical trial, I sort of double down on the clinical trial as a concept of operation that will be used both publicly and privately. I would also say the intelligence community, for as much as we obsess over them in the media and obsess over them in our discussions of national security, they're a very small drop in the bucket when it comes to R&D and the actual actions of tech and data and connectivity in this world. And so I do think that while maybe transparency will be lacking in some areas that we actually expect a lack of transparency, I don't expect the CIA to tell me everything they do and how they do it. I do think it's a different conversation with health insurance companies, with credit companies like TransUnion and Equifax. I think it's a fundamentally different conversation with vast majorities of our government and private sector.
Very well said, and I agree. It's not one size fits all, and I don't know of many generals who will telegraph their battle plans before they fight the battle. That just doesn't usually work too well. All right, so Divya, interested in your thoughts as well on this topic as well.
Yeah, so something that Bob said made me think of a really great example. So, Bob was talking about countering disinformation with really good public messaging. South Korea had actually this issue. They had started a vaccination campaign. It wasn't a COVID one. And there were some negative side effects in the sense that some people died immediately. One person had a heart attack. And they immediately went to see, was there a true correlation between that? Or was that just spurious? Certain numbers of people die every day and certain numbers of people have heart attacks every day. And when they realized there was really no connection between the vaccination and these events, they immediately got out a public message to counter that disinformation so that they could build back public trust in vaccination campaigns. And that's something that would be just so useful to do, so useful to leverage. But I also think that we can't leave it up to our government, and we need a lot more data literacy amongst our citizens. I had at one point proposed this idea that we ought to be teaching not just students, but also adults in this country, but our citizenry in general to treat data and how it comes in using something akin to the scientific method, right? Now, that doesn't, I had this conversation with someone else, and it doesn't mean everybody becomes a scientist or this is in this realm of natural science. All it means is that these are critical thinking skills that scientists deploy in order to do a few things. One, we make observations about the universe, the world, And then you have to say, how reliable is the observation? And some of that probability is actually based on your instrument. Some instruments are incredibly reliable. Some of them are really, really noisy. And we take that into account. Then we look to see if that observation is repeated in a number of different areas. And so we're both verifying and trusting the source and also re-verifying it over and over. We bring it in to create a hypothesis. And then if there's new information that comes in that disrupts the hypothesis, we're willing to let go of it. And those kinds of critical thinking skills, I think, would serve our entire populace really, really well. Another thing we could be doing, which is scientists have some of the luxury of understanding how reliable their data sources are. Shouldn't we be finding ways to label our data sources? We talked about that 40 plus billion IoT devices. We have all kinds of data sources coming into social media. How is it that we can create trust networks where we can at least have whichever instrument, whichever data producer is entering a network, label itself and say, hi, this is who I am. And, we may have a sense of how reliable or trustworthy they are. It would, I think, help a lot of people make more informed decisions and be less susceptible to disinformation.
Excellent. Really appreciate that, Divya. And I liked how you also said that, we do need to think about being more critical in how we think about how we approach data. You mentioned the scientific method. I think Bob would probably also say, in some respects, that's being a good intelligence analyst. That's good tradecraft. So whichever way, think like a spy or think like a scientist. Maybe we need to apply the data. Joe, I want to go to you with another question that we have from Dr. Tiffany Vora, which says, in addition to broadband infrastructure, what other infrastructures are key for a data forward future? Be interested in your thoughts in that area.
Thank you for the question. I would say outside of the broadband infrastructure, I think that that's a great question. I'm trying to think because I focus so much on 5G. I don't have a good answer yet.
All right. Well, I know you've been talking earlier about space and you've been talking about healthcare. So I don't know if there's thoughts that you have there in terms of, do we need to think about what we change about how space is made available to the public, or even just assets or things collected from space?
So my first inkling is to say that when we look at overall, I think that the infrastructure that needs to be developed, maybe not necessarily broadband, but bridging the digital divide, I've talked to you about this before, is bringing people onto the internet, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be broadband, but I think in order to build these trusted networks that Melissa's talked about and that Bob and Divya's talked about, we need to allow people to have access to that information, right? And so right now, we work in a world where we're all on the internet and we're all able to see these things and talk pretty quickly, in situ. Whereas many of the people in the world don't have this access. And so when I think about infrastructure outside, I wouldn't, it's not to sidestep the question, but it's really to say how many people are not online right now and how many people are not having access. And if they don't have access, how do we get them access so that we can begin to build that trusted network that we focused on. Outside of that, I do think that we need to we've talked about this in other GeoTech hours, we need to figure out how we're going to have reliable internet in space. I think we need to figure out how we can bounce these things off of satellites that are in space so that we are not pinging ourselves and having a lag time coming back down to the earth to send it back up. These things are going to be very important when we start thinking about the Artemis, or going to the moon or going to Mars, and really having the ability to not have a lag in that data transmission or a break in that data transmission. Those are my two quick answers. I'll do a rejoinder and come back. I'm gonna actually think.
Sure.
On that for a second.
Sounds good. I appreciate it. Melissa, I see you have a rejoinder, and then I'm going to go to the fun question, probably first to Bob, about how much should we respond to China tech? But first, Melissa, you had a rejoinder to what Joe answered.
I love this question about infrastructure because I think this is a place where the government could play a really interesting role and get creative. I think we could start to think about sort of networks of access that are almost kiosk based. I think we could think about networks of access to prototyping capabilities that are publicly provided, right? If you're an entrepreneur in my state, I'm in Missouri right now, I can imagine an entrepreneur having an idea that they could make something, that they could manufacture something that's key to an area that's a little less easy to get capital from investors in. And you could actually like go in, have somebody help you make the CAD designs, help you 3D print it, help you send it off somewhere to have it developed in maybe some regional places that the government would work with industry and states to do matching funds to create publicly accessible spaces to actually manufacture and create new concepts that could be converted into economic activity. I could just imagine infrastructure being more like a network of accelerators and sort of the fundamental needs that people have in transferring their ideas into reality, rather than just thinking about it like the traditional things which we also need. We need to think about our roads and our power structures that are aging. I mean, we have to think about traditional infrastructure, but on top of it, the new superhighways are places you can store your data securely that we'll give you access to for free if you're going to stay in the state, or if you're going to stay in the United States, right? We'll give you access to a national repository. I think that we could really get creative around an infrastructure package that really thinks about the types of capabilities we want to grow in this country from the bottom up. And we could do that with matching funds with industry and states and high net worth individuals who care about these topics, not just the government in charge telling everybody what to do and trying to use tax dollars to do it.
Very well said, and I liked how you talked about it. So it's about providing people the opportunities. So thinking about infrastructure as opportunities that can provide it at a regional basis. So I really like that. Joe, did you have a real quick rejoinder before I go to Bob's fun question about can we trust China tech?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I thought about it, and Melissa, thank you for kind of spurring that thought process for me. I think we need to really focus on private-public partnerships, right? So I think the industry and corporate America are something that we, right now we're at ends, right? So from everything from Section 230 I saw someone ask the question about in big tech to everything moving forward. But how do we move forward together, right? We need to understand, it's dollars and cents for corporations and it's the people for the government. And how do we meet a nice sweet spot so that we can do those things? I think Melissa's point was very potent, because the makerspace is something that we're all doing now, right? So makerspace and everybody wanting to be their own individual engineer. How do we kind of move that around? I know the National Science Foundation is working on that, but thank you for spurring that thought process for me, because I was definitely stumped for a second there.
Excellent. I see Divya has a real quick rejoinder, and then we'll
Very
get to Bob's
quick.
answer.
I'm just going to throw a couple of words out. The broadband's the connectivity piece. You need a data infrastructure and you need the network infrastructure to bring all those three pieces together. And I'm just going to throw in there, and I think Bob will probably wax eloquent about it, but we haven't really mentioned artificial intelligence and algorithmic intelligence, but this is deploying this both at the edges and at the center are going to be really, really key. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Excellent. All right. So Bob, this all sounds great, but of course, we're obviously going to involve technology. Not all this technology is going to be built here in the United States. Some of it may become overseas. There are questions about, can we trust technology and services coming from China? What would be your recommendations to the new administration for how to handle this?
My recommendation would be to build upon the decade plus of policy work that has been put into this very question. It was not just an instantaneous shift. It's oversimplistic to say that the Trump administration came in and all of a sudden there was issues with China. I think we could give the Trump administration a lot of credit for bringing those issues faster forward and making people realize the seriousness of the issues. But these are things that policymakers have been dealing with for a long time, including many of us Cassandras who were saying that the Chinese Communist Party has goals and objectives that are different than ours. And everybody should believe that. Every citizen should convince themselves of that. And there's enough information they can do that. The Chinese Communist Party has goals and objectives that are not ours. And we need to counter that. But we do want to take advantage of great technology, no matter where it comes from. And we want to help shape and influence things in a positive way. And to underscore that point, I want to mention something. First of all, back to the pandemic, it's a very solemn figure, but I believe by the end of the night tonight, there will be 2 million dead globally because of COVID. Mm-hmm. Now, we've seen vaccines globally being created and just now put into the supply chain. Very soon, many of us will be able to take a vaccine. and it is really going to save humanity. I mean, I don't know how much it's going to save, but let's say 1 billion lives are saved because of this vaccine being done so quickly. And who do you credit for that? Do you credit Operation Warp Speed? That helps a bit. Do you credit Moderna and Pfizer? Well, they sure are instrumental. But who's the real hero here? The real hero here, in my opinion, is Yongzhen Zhang, a professor in China who took the very brave move after realizing what was going on here to sequence this virus. He looked at the data and said, ooh, this is a lot like SARS. And on his own, he published that to the global internet. 3 days later, Moderna is able to say, I think we can produce a vaccine. So my hero, a Chinese citizen, Yongzhen Zhang, a professor at Shanghai Public Health Clinical Center and Public School of Health. And it's just an example of the fact that we need to tap into brains wherever they are. And there are good people everywhere working on technology issues. And I hate to say that a lot of them are under the control and influence of a dominant communist party like the Communist Party of China. I don't like that. But when someone creates something good there, we need to be able to take advantage of it. And that's just an example. So how does that translate to policy? We need to review all policies, and the smart ones we keep. And we need to move supply chains back into the U.S. More and more and more. We need to be, dependent on ourselves and not overly reliant on anyone. But we need to push for more open exchange of ideas and technology, and be able to understand what to bring in and what not. Easier said than done, I guess.
But that was a great response. And I actually liked, you channeled Bill Joy's comment of no matter where you go, most of the smartest people work for someone else. And I think what we need to recognize is when it comes to tech and data, we are increasingly in a global world in which there are people in other countries, but there are also people that may not even have access to the internet to contribute to their thoughts. And I think this points to how we can actually address these things going forward, Bob. I really liked how you shared it. And also saying, how can we make it so that the US is attractive as a partner in this, as opposed to someone that has seemed like you don't want to partner with us. So we've got about 3 minutes before we go to the lightning round, folks, where I'm going to ask for your recommendations and how they get done. Obviously, we could continue this conversation, and we will. Real quick before we go to that, I did want to actually ask, I think this is going to probably be, I'm trying to think, this is going to be a conversation about regulating big tech. And so I'm going to go to Melissa first, because you sort of put that out there. As we move forward, can we even do regulation by geography anymore? Can we do it at the speed that's relevant for tech? You've got 3 minutes. What are your thoughts?
Look, I think that governments can do a lot of things, and you can love it or you can hate it. And you can spend a lot of time talking about it, or you could start to red team what are the positive ways to make change. Look, the big tech companies have behaved badly in a lot of ways, and nobody's too big to fail. So maybe they need to step up and start thinking about how do we create data commons that aren't totally dependent on being owned by big companies. Maybe we need to step forward and say you have to create safe spaces to engage small companies that doesn't allow you to rape and pillage their IP, and then just take all their people and force them to work for you in the Borg cube. The other thing that we need to do is respect the fact that these big tech companies have fundamentally opened up opportunities for our country and our world that did not exist before. And we should appreciate the fact that maybe the monopoly looks slightly different now than it did in the days of Ma Bell, and be thoughtful about that. But I don't think there's like a pat answer of like the big tech companies are good or the big tech companies are bad. They're companies. They're not people. They don't have feelings. And they are not human beings no matter what the law says. And so if we have concerns, then regulation needs to take into account both the concerns that we have, but also the solutions that have to go into mitigating the negative effects that we are positive those regulatory steps will create.
Excellent, well said. And I'm going to channel, building on Bob's quote about the future is already here, just unevenly distributed. The rejoinder is the best way to predict the future is to create it. So with that, actually, now we're going to go to the lightning round. And so we're going to now sort of close with the thoughts that you all have in terms of what you think the administration can do as hows. And this needs to be tweet length because we've got about 10 minutes left. So if you can each take about 2 minutes. Divya, Up to 3 tweet length recommendations about the how as to what you think the administration should do. Oh, and you're muted. No worries.
I'm going to start with something that's near and dear to both of our hearts. I think that the United States needs to start leading an effort on creating both a US-based and a global immune system for future pandemic prevention, surveillance, etc. We haven't gotten into the nitty-gritty of this, but it's absolutely doable if we were to implement many of the data policies and surveillance. And here I don't mean human surveillance, I mean surveillance of all these multiple biomes that we could. I think we need to invest more into our cybersecurity infrastructure. We've been seeing lots of recent hacks. We haven't talked a lot about the recent Russian hack, but the hacking and the ransomware attacks also on our cyber health infrastructure have been quite devastating, in fact. And then as far as artificial intelligence and quantum go, I agree with Bob 100%. We need to invest tons in that. And an example here would be using artificial intelligence to do everything from modeling vaccine rollout and distribution and efficacy to actually using artificial intelligence intelligently for things like drug design and pharmaceutical design, or to track mutations in this particular virus or future viruses.
Excellent and very well said. And of course, I really do appreciate it. Again, it's near and dear to our heart that we need to think about both a US and a global immune system for the planet. I will say for our audience that's listening, if you check out our website, gtc.atlanticcouncil.org, we are having a private roundtable on this on January 15th. If you send us a note, we'd be happy to invite you. This is something that we want to build together and build together with partners to go fast. Next, we'd like to go to Joe for your up to 3 tweet links recommendations as to what the how of the recommendations as what the new administration should do.
So I'm going to focus on the beginning of their presidency and kind of the pandemic. And so I think what we would have to do, right, we still have a supply chain and logistics issue. And I think that given the Internet of Things and our ability to know what's on the ground and what's going on, we need to have what I'm going to call just-in-time medicine, right? So we need to have a access point to where if we know a hospital doesn't have enough ventilators, there's no reason that we are not able to transport these things in an efficient and fast manner. And so I'm going to, my quote for the day is going to be just-in-time medicine, or it's a huge thing in additive manufacturing, but we're going to move it over to the kind of the telehealth world. The other thing is I think we need to understand the consequences of our actions in doing this telemedicine. So what are we missing, right? So there hasn't been any large studies on what are the care benefits from telehealth and from telemedicine. And so I think that that's something that will come out in the future. And I think Melissa gave the best answer for my Internet of Things, or the Internet of Behaviors. I think we need to have some type of digital I've forgotten the word now. Digital
co-op for commons or something?
Digital clinical trial. I was trying to come up with a word I couldn't think, but we need to kind of do that and see what happens as we try to go back to what life is in a normal basis on a day-to-day basis.
Well, what I really like about all 3 recommendations that you presented, Joe, is they are all representing a shift to more data-centric informed policy actions. And so maybe as a bumper sticker, we need to make America data-centric. I would say again, but maybe just in the first time, just do it once. So I really appreciate those recommendations. Thank you, Joe. All right, Melissa, your 3 tweet link recommendations regarding the how for the years ahead.
The role of the government is changing, and the private sector, high net worth individuals, philanthropy, states, academia, these are all critical, not only funders, but decision makers in all of our policies. The administration needs to create a director for domestic alliances in the National Security Council, and that director needs to focus on understanding the true roles and capacity and capabilities across all of these actors in this country, and they need to do it day one. We also need a director for technical domestic alliances that needs to be stood up in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. We've always had an entire branch that focuses on international alliances. I think that is critical, but I think it is equally critical to understand that we actually haven't built alliances to the over $300 billion of R&D funding annually that is not federally funded in this country, and we need to get on it. 90% of R&D is performed outside of the government. 75% is funded outside of the federal government in the US. We need someone who understands that ecosystem, not just a punitive approach. And the third is we need to take a fundamentally different approach to research security. The conversation around Chinese tech and involvement in the sort of ecosystem and the changing norms. We need to essentially realize that a small company is never going to call the FBI and ask about a hiring decision for a Chinese national if they think they're now going to be monitored. This shouldn't be punitive. This should be something that we do in the private sector, in a nonprofit or an association. And actually, I'll be putting out a paper on this shortly. I feel so strongly that we have got to lean into providing data-driven resources so that companies and academia and even philanthropies can really make informed decisions about the amount of access they are providing to the people that they are thinking about hiring or collaborating with, and the actual cost benefit analysis, so that we don't, in fact, as Bob said, shut down the great ideas, but we do take seriously that we don't necessarily want to give everyone total access to our data and to our networks and to our people. And so we can do this, but this is something that if we had a director for technical domestic alliances, they could be working to help create this in the private sector in a non-punitive way to give our country, which is where our capability comes from and what we are trying to protect and secure, international security community, the ability to actually have this as a resource.
Really love that. And to build on your points 1 and 3, like you said, on day one, it's really talking about that presidential policy directive #1, which we know is always about how is the national security community set up. And so having that as an include, I hope folks are listening. We'll try and do our best to promote it. But thank you for that, Melissa. I also liked how you were talking about how we think about how we do so in a way that is not punitive, but it really is trying to actually sort of tap into the more beneficial model. All right, Bob, bring it home for us. What are your 3 tweet recommendations?
Well, first I would say that keeping in mind what I said earlier, that you really got to believe the future's here. It's just not evenly distributed. I think most of the issues we brought up today, there are policy experts who put a lot of deep thought into these that can help the administration, including many here at the Atlantic Council. There's one area where there's probably not enough policy work, and that I mentioned trust. I mentioned the blockchain. So I would recommend strongly to the new administration that they get somebody really smart and understands what these words mean. They need to understand the words Bitcoin, Ethereum, Chainlink, the graph, the DeFi movement, and Sushi Swap. Now I will, I'll send a tweet out with all of these shortly. They're very important, but you can learn through Twitter all these new words. It's extremely important to our collective future. There's also a couple pioneers, these people that, William Gibson would say are creating our future on the internet. One is explaining all this, a guy named Ryan Sean Adams. He runs an outfit called Bankless. He's a great explainer of these technologies. And then Michael Saylor, a famous CEO of MicroStrategy, who is a new convert to this world of distributed finance, a tremendous explainer of why this new technology is important. So my tweet-like recommendations, which I will put in Twitter, are that the new administration find the policy people who can explain these new technologies to them and are fluent in them.
Very well said. I really appreciate it. Like you said, it is about trying to explain and bridge and to be able to actually pull together those communities. Bringing home what you all said as well, we need to think about, and this builds on a little bit about what you said, Bob and Melissa, we don't have the ability to connect our domestic activities to our international activities well. And if we're talking about building a coalition of digital democracies for the future ahead, we've got to be able to bridge those two. We cannot keep them separate. So I want to thank you all. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Divya. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Bob, for a really amazing GeoTech Hour. We will definitely have to have follow-ups. I heard at least a conversation about how we can actually link high net individuals in philanthropy to government. So that will probably be something we tee up in the future. But I also want to thank all our audience for your great questions. And as always, want to encourage everyone to be bold, to be brave, and to be benevolent for the future ahead. We'll see you again next time.
Thanks all.